So welcome back, everybody. This is Night Flight, and as you can see, Gary Wayne is back. And our topic of today will be Tuatha de Danann. And I'm pretty sure we will also talk about the dragon courts. I mean, that is somehow everything is connected there. And I'm pretty sure it will be a very interesting talk. So, Gary, welcome. And we have a new pope.
We do. We definitely do, yes.
So, what are your first impressions?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. And I was on some shows before the voting started, and people are saying, who do you think the favorite is going to be? And so I was not wanting to pick a horse in it because I couldn't get my sort of head around the politics of it. What I did know is Francis had picked at least 61 and appointed cardinals and put them in place and promoted many to high levels, and including the one who has become Pope Leo the 14th. So, was one of his favorite individuals and was almost like a favored sort of son, but that's got nothing to do with how the politics works within the conclave of the voting. So I wasn't prepared to make a pick whatsoever. And the one that, Leo is, born in the US, which is generally thought of as never going to have a superpower
Hmm.
as a pope, except that, if I recall, it's a bit of hypocrisy because all of the first, the popes were all from the superpower Roman Empire for a long period of time. So, but maybe that's what had made them say that they don't want it, somebody that's going to be that close to the power and working with them. But so, yeah, interesting choice for sure. One of the things that, I took some heat over with the last pope, right from the beginning when I came out with social media, people are saying, well, he's Antichrist, he's the false prophet, he's the last pope. And I'm going, well, no, number one, it's debatable depending on who you're talking to, whether or not the prophecies of Malachi has it ending with Francis. Other than a lot of people think that, and the copy that I have might suggest it, but I'm told there's an extension of at least one more pope that's out of the standard publication of the prophecies, and I can't verify that, but apparently that comes sort of out of the Vatican. And so I said, maybe he's the last pope, maybe he's a transition pope in preparation, but he's none of those other things that are coming down the line. So, and even though people were saying, well, he's the black pope because he comes out of the Jesuits, and that fits up not with the prophecies of Saint Malachi, but with Rosicrucian prophecy for a black pope. So again, people are looking for a black pope skin color. They got Francis, who, was white, but of another organization. And then for this one election, again, people were saying, well, it's going to go to one of two people in Africa because it's going to be a black pope. And again, trying to overlay all of that on there. So when we look at who this individual is, he's a member of the Augustine order, monastic order. And for people researching that, just keep in mind there's two Augustines, two orders of Augustine. One is Augustine of Canterbury, who is the architect for that and part of the Roman Collegia of Builders, Manichaeans mold into the Catholic Church, who built all of the churches and could remain hidden in plain sight within Roman Catholicism. And that was absorbed into the Cistercian, and there are Cistercians, but officially absorbed into the Benedictine order by Saint Bernard, who sponsored the Templars. So, um, but my understanding is Leo is not associating himself with the Cistercians, but with a special order that comes from Augustine of Hippo, which is predates one of the church fathers. One predates Augustine of Canterbury about 600 AD to Augustine of Hippo was about 354 to 43, 443. And the mystical body of Christ and the rule of Augustine, you don't want to mix those two up because two different orders there. but certainly they go by the rule of Augustine, which is a very ascetic order, which is like the Jesuits, and so likely a Gnostic order, and very much zealots on liberation theology, which is Jesuit philosophy, and on Mary and Mary apparitions and the veneration of Mary. And his first oration came in a church dedicated to Mary. So expect the dualism to be raised up higher with Augustine. He's said to be a moderate. So he's not Jesuit and he's not conservative, but he's similar to the Jesuits, and he may be more conservative in clothing and traditions, and maybe even on the odd doctrine that has gotten so far out of whack within the doctrine level. But I don't think he's going to reign as a conservative. I think they're going to continue to add to their theology and to their socialistic global intentions. So I think this is an extension of Francis. I think it's the one he probably would have liked to have had in place, as the one he seemed to be mentoring and promoting. And we'll have to wait and see what he actually does. But it's interesting that he would name himself Leo. The Leo the 13th is
Mhm.
the one who reinstated all of the Jesuit powers back to its original state, noting that in the early 1800s, the Jesuits were so out of control that they were disbanded. The royals forced it. They were tired of having them assassinate them. So it was a lot of interaction between the two, and that the Jesuits weren't following the agenda and objectives that they had. So after a series of popes who are imprisoned in France, they decide we need to bring back the Jesuit order, but they don't bring it to full status level. It's the next pope that does that, and that was Leo the 13th and Domitor Inter Lea. And he also granted Our Lady Montserrat Basilica status, which is the Black Madonna that was elevated to the patron of Catalonia. And of course, that's also more of the polytheist side of the Mary apparition, and a demonstration that Mary appears to people in many different ways, and as it appeals to their religion. So we see apparitions around the world. We hear reports of Inanna in Mesopotamia. We hear Hathor and Isis in Africa. So expect that these are a similar type of apparition that plays to a particular sect of polytheism.
Yeah. Yeah, and Leo the 13th, he was a pretty political pope as well. He wrote
Very much so.
encyclia on workers' rights and
Yep.
founding unions and good
Yep.
working conditions. So,
Yep.
yeah, and the name that they choose usually give a general direction in which
Yeah, just
they're
as
going.
Francis
Mm.
is one that I think the Pope actually lived and did things in a similar way to the Francis that he took the name from. So it's definitely an indication.
Yeah.
So we'll have to wait and see. So what is he a transition? I don't think he's the necessarily the last Pope. So if he's a fairly young, so unless he's assassinated, he's going to have to do a bunch of things to be the last Pope that'll make the way for the false prophet. But certainly with the initiated prophets through these apparitions around the world, that you're going to see the false prophets that are going to have to be coming front and center to bring about the universal church. So that may be working in preparation, but I just see there's so many things yet to do that people should not get too far ahead of where we are in the end time chronology.
Yeah. Yeah, I personally thought that this time around they would pick an African or an Asian pope.
Yep,
But anyhow, it's a first because he is an American.
yep,
And, with the last pope, I have heard that since, well, since I can remember um, when John Paul II died. Yeah. And every time a pope dies, I hear the same story. Now the last pope is coming in, and
Yep.
now
And
the
it's just,
last pope is coming in. Now the
yeah,
last pope is
yes.
coming in.
And it's like, and everybody that they see as a rising politician is the next Antichrist.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, so, there's so much damage done to what prophecy actually says by these people who usurp it and use it for their own personal agenda in, 15 minutes of fame, that by the time we get to the point of the last pope and the false prophet and the antichrist, end time
Nobody's
Christian prophecy is
listening.
going, nobody's going to listen. It's like, crying wolf. The sky is
Yeah,
falling, right? So,
yeah, yeah,
and
exactly.
maybe that's the plan.
Yeah, but I
Maybe
think
part of it.
it
Or
might be, but I think a lot of people are participating involuntarily. They are not really aware that they are doing damage
yes.
to that when they blow
Yep.
the horn every 5 minutes.
Yes.
So yeah, and
And then have the gall to say you're a heretic and you're doing blasphemy if you're questioning their timetable. It's like, that I hear all the time, oh no, you're a heretic. I got this right from the Holy Spirit. And my general response back is two things. One is the Holy Spirit would never contradict what Jesus said if
mm,
you're a Christian. And number two is that maybe you should test who that spirit is,
yeah,
as we're told to, because you're not being consistent with scriptures. So
mm, yeah. Yeah, no, nobody is talking to me. No,
yeah.
no spirits or whatsoever.
Yeah,
So
that that's
I
a good
can't.
thing. That's a
I
good thing.
Yeah, I personally
Yeah,
prefer that.
yeah,
The f- if that would happen to me, I would question the hell out of it,
yeah,
because my first thought would be, what kind of evil spirit do you have around here, and why is it here,
yeah.
and how can I get rid of it? That would be my first reaction.
Yeah. Well, we do want to be careful with that. And there's a difference between following what you think is correct based on what you think that you're being shown, to saying, I'm talking with God or I'm talking with the Holy Spirit. And I'm not saying that that can't happen. I'm just
Mhm.
saying it's rare,
Mhm.
very rare.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And that all, a lot of when I was still flying, and on Sundays, let's say I was in Los Angeles, and on Sundays I switched on the TV.
Yep.
And yeah, then you have a lot of programs where evangelists are having their service, and they are broadcasting it. And what I found it a little bit irritating when they always said, yeah, and last morning when I woke up, the Lord said to me this and this and the other. And and I always thought, how do you know?
Yeah. How did you? Yeah, it's key. How did you verify that?
Yeah, yeah. So
So test the spirits. Always test the spirits.
yeah. So okay, Tuatha de Danann. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Loosely translated, the people of the goddess Danu. And what I found interesting, there is not very much about the goddess. Yeah, she's a primordial a goddess. She's a mother goddess, a fertility goddess,
Yep.
but that's about it, what you can find. But what I did find interesting was that we find her also in Hinduism. And um, there she is a primordial goddess, and she was the mother of the people that were known as Danavas. And my thinking is that also what we have here in Europe, the
Mhm.
Danes from Denmark, that has also something to do with this goddess. So what say you?
Yeah, there's two aspects of the name of Danann. So certainly, let's start with Danu, also the equivalent to Diana in the Roman pantheon, and she was the queen of the fairies, or the mother god of the fairies, and the source of the fairies. And that the Tuatha De Danann are also the fair folk or the fairy folk as giants. So definitely an interconnection there. There's other Irish and Tuatha De Danann goddesses by different sort of names, like Morgan and other ones, but it's all reflecting the same mother goddess. And so this is, as you say, it's a proto-Latin, it's proto Greek, it's Indo-Aryan of the original pantheon that peoples moved into later after Babel and intermixed, and you get this sort of consolidation of different names and transliterations, but you have this connection that goes all the way through from, as you say, India, right to Russia and Moscow, to right through to Germany, up the Danube River, into Norway and Sweden, into England and Ireland and Scotland, into Spain. It is so large that in speaking almost an identical language and the same descriptions and the same religion, that you need to be looking at them in a way that you understand that it's probably the same different people. And they're also known as Indo-Aryans, and there's like 4 to 5 different groups depending on who you're talking with as the individual groups of those Indo-Aryans. So like the dark-haired Aryans, which were also in southern Greece, were in Anatolia, were in Syria, the two major groups that came down from the mountains to the east, they settled into the Persia region from where the Achaemenid dynasties take their genealogies back to, and into the Indus Valley and the start of Sanskrit and the Hindu religion from there, and the Persian Zoroastrian religion, which has very similar spelling to the names and gods, and were used in treaties and documents throughout their involvement throughout the Middle East, are reflecting two different aspects of the same language and the same sort of religion. And then you have the red hair and the blonde-haired variety with blue eyes and hazel eyes. And but they're all part of those 5 sort of groups. So when we look at the name Danann, just so that people don't get hung up on it, it has multiple names for the same people, and also has some transliterations that you can get to once you understand who they're talking about. So in the old languages, the D and the T were interchangeable and the same sound. So when we get Dadan in the Bible with 2 Ds, that's the same tribe that they're talking about. But you might also have that as Ditanu, as in the Ugaritic text, for the assembly of the giants that report to the council of the gods. And the Titanu are the same sort of tribe. So, and when you get into the Greek Titan, where you, as in Ditanu, you have the D and the T both being used and essentially being the same sound, you could have had that as 2 T's. And if you drop that suffix of the Mesopotamian region with the U, you get Titan or Dighton, or Dighton, as we would pronounce it in how we would do it today. And there are, again, you have Titans of the earth, Titans of the heaven. And so
Mhm.
the giants are the same sort of people. So You're going to hear Tuatha Danann with E's and A's in different spellings. You're going to see Tuatha Danann without the duh, because they say the duh is in the Danann.
Mhm,
When
mhm,
they use that, you're going to just see the Tuatha Danu. And Tuatha or Tuatha, and again, you got the D and the T there. That's the same sort of transliteration. That means people of or tribe of. So, as in Diana would be the tribe of Diana, but it also has Anu in it. And so you get the Tuatha Danu with the D apostrophe A-N-U. And so you may have them being procreated by both a parent god of a male and a female variety. But typically, the fairy understanding is more the matriarchal bloodline than the patriarchal bloodline, as we understand that as that comes down in their allegories. And you also have Marianu, which is the name of Indo-Aryans in the Middle East as well, are part of the same group. And then you get into just the Dawin part. So you have Dawin She or Sade, and that means the people of the stars. Stars are angels. Um, you also have area She, so Aryan She or Sade, and Sadea and Sad. And it has so many transliterations with Sidhe as to how it's spelled. Um, and so you have the fairy She or the fairy Sade or the seed or however you want to pronounce it. There's 100 different pronunciations of it. And you also have She or Sade, meaning the ever living ones, and Aryans as being the noble ones.
mhm.
And they are the ring lords and they are the overlords of these civilizations, which has words that carry over into multiple language, like Oberon, as with the King of the Fairies in Shakespeare. Uber is rooted into Indo-Aryan for the same derivative of words. So um, I just wanted to get that on the table that this is a large group and
Mhm.
they migrated. So there's different aspects to it to sort of take apart and understand, and also that they lived both before the flood, then again after the flood. And so they're either recreated by the offspring gods after the flood, or they survive. And some accounts would take them to Tartarus, as they're connected to the Tartarian mythos today, and escaping from Tartarus after the flood to restart the ancient people of the antediluvian epoch. So that's
What are
just
the
an opening
offspring?
volume of the size of the topic that we're about to dig into.
Yeah, what are the offspring gods?
So if you look at different pantheons, like let's say Greek, for example, so Kronos is the head patriarch deity before the flood, but Zeus is after the flood, and Gaia is his counterpart as the queen of heaven, right? But so Zeus is an offspring of Kronos and is
Mhm.
considered an offspring god. So the offspring gods in all of the pantheons around the world, they rebel against the parent gods and are said to either kill them or put them into Tartarus or to a prison of some sort. And so if we look at the Canaanite pantheon for Christians that might be out there, you have El and Ashtaroth as the parent gods before the flood, and then Baal and Anat after the flood, and the Baalim council that's talked about in the Bible that rules at Mount Saphon in the Ugaritic text, or Mount Sion, Shinir, Sion, and Mount Hermon as we know it as it's listed biblically. So it's important to understand who the offspring gods are and who the parent gods are so you understand where in history it fits. But what gets complicated is the offspring gods inherit much of the mythos of the parent gods because they take the title, right? They're
Mhm.
part of what we call the host of heaven, which is Hebrew Seraph, or an army of angels. And there's a loyal army and there's a disloyal army from a monotheist perspective. And if you have angels that are removed or killed and or put into the pit prison, which is, I think, killing is is an allegory for being in the pit prison, then you're going to have other ones that move up and replace them, right?
Mm.
Because of the rank and the order. So they inherit that mythos and that position. So you have offspring gods before the flood that are known as Queen of Heaven, like Inanna, like Gaia. I won't use the Egyptian one um, for the consort of Osiris, which are offspring gods, but you also have Ra and a Queen of Heaven that's before the flood in the Egyptian pantheon, just like you do all over the world. So it's important to understand those distinctions. They just moved up and replaced them and ruled from the same council that's talked about both before and after the flood. So we have two histories of Tuatha De Danann to reconcile, which are more limited with the antediluvian aspect, and then the post-diluvian or after the flood history of the Tuatha De Danann. And we should keep those separate. So if we're reading like the um, Labor Gala, if I got that, my memory serves me right, of the history of the Irish that talks about the Tuatha De Danann, then you're going to have times in the age of Cain, and then you're going to have times that are after the flood. So again, if we want to understand the history, we have to look at who's reigning as gods and what period of time is being referred to.
Mhm. Yeah. So that would be like in Greek mythology, the war between the Titans and what was this other group um, that overthrew them? Ah, it's slipping. What?
In Greek mythology that you're referring to,
Mhm. Titans and
Olympians.
exactly. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, I wasn't sure that that was the one you were looking for or another, because there's a
No,
couple different
yeah.
titles for these
So
beings.
that
So
would be an example of that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and that both ruled from Mount Olympus.
Yeah.
So both would be Olympians.
Mm, mm,
And but you can see how the offspring gods of like Poseidon and Zeus and all the 12 that go with it inherit that whole mythos. And so Poseidon likely isn't the god who created the 10 Titan kings for Atlantis, because he's an offspring god and is ruling after the flood, and Atlantis is destroyed by the flood as part of the larger sort of conflagration of catastrophes. Iapetus was the god of the sea before the flood, part of the parent gods, who also created giants before the flood, like Gog, Magog, and Albion, which are giants that we see show up after the flood. But it's common for giants after the flood to either inherit part of that mythos as well, or just be named after the historical record of giants before the flood.
yeah. So according to Irish legends, the Tuatha De Danann, they came from the sky
Yep.
with a lot of mist, but they couldn't land because the Fomorians, that is another mystical
Yep.
race, um, had a energy field around that place, and they couldn't penetrate that. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so Fomorians are giants as well.
Mm-hmm.
So not likely able to stop the parents who come from other planets to produce the Tuatha De Danann.
Mm-hmm.
But the Fomorians are there before the Tuatha De Danann, both in that legend and also after the flood. But after the flood, they're migrating there from Scythia. And so the Fomorians are kind of giants that are more akin to the Cyclops. And
Yeah.
and so they are a group that um, could be in that sort of polytheist accounting and legend, either survivors of the flood or more cyclops are created after the flood. And cyclops are like an offspring god originally, who also produce offspring that are giants in Greek mythology. And so the cyclops also show up again after the flood. So there may be, again, that designation of these one-eyed physical gods and giants that are both before and after the flood. Sometimes the records are saying these are like ones who are cursed, and so they're deformed, but they're still part of the Shea people, part of the spirits after they died. So they are part of the same type of greater type of creation, but they're definitely unique. And who knows, they may be ones that were survivors of the flood, and the Tuatha De Danann migrate there after the flood. But most accounts in Irish history has the accounting of the Fomorians there after the flood. So a people after the flood. So when I look at the fairy accounts of the Tuatha De Danann, these are fairies led by the Great Fairy, who comes from other planets, and they seed with human females offspring that are going to become the Tuatha De Danann. Now, again, that is likely more antediluvian in its first accounting, but you have offspring gods who do the same thing. And how do we know that? Well, Zeus, as I said, is an offspring god. He creates Hercules after the flood. Doesn't mean there wasn't a Hercules before the flood, but he's an offspring god who rules after the flood, and all of a sudden starts to make better sense of when he lived with Greek history, because he's kind of out of place as people try and place them in there. And other giants like Perseus and Theseus were also created by Zeus. Gilgamesh is a offspring god, produced by an offspring god, a mother goddess in this case, Nin or Ninsun, and she mates with King Lugalbanda in the sixth generation after the flood to create Gilgamesh. Again, we get Gilgamesh in the Book of Giants, that's before the flood, so likely named after that, and probably inherits some of that mythos as well. And the best example for Christians on this one, other than the Greeks say that there's two races of giants, one that was killed in the wars, which is a reference to what led up to the flood, and then the second race of giants that are created after the flood by gods like Zeus. And so in the Ugaritic texts, we have Baal and the Baalim Council, just as we have that in the Bible, and they created giants for the assembly of giants, the Danu assembly, and they're also called the Raphaim as their original creation, as something distinct from the Nephilim. So in the Bible, we get Nephilim, typically referred to before the flood, except for the one passage in Numbers 13:33, which is the embellishment part of the report of the scouts trying to raise the Anakim to Nephilim type status. Not that Anakim weren't giants, they were, but they're from, in Deuteronomy 2, from Rapha. So we have to distinguish, there's something different between the Raphaim and the Nephilim, likely one before and one after the flood. And so and we don't get how Raphaim show up after the flood by a smoking gun verse like Genesis 6:4. You could use Genesis 6:4 to say how they show up, but we don't get that smoking gun verse. So they either survive, the Rephaim are either there before the flood and survive, or they're recreated, but it is the offspring gods, not Banat, but the Baal and Anat and Amaru, that are creating these gods or these giants after the flood. So I think when we look at the understanding of giants both before and after the flood, again, it helps us to understand when some of these events sort of took place. And the Tuatha De Danann also have waves of migration to Ireland. So again, one could be before the flood in that understanding, but you have many migrations, and along with the Milesians that are going to intermarry with the Tuatha De Danann, that's part of this whole mixture, but there's Scythians as well. So it's kind of just regenerating more of the same bloodline, so to speak.
I'm so happy this world makes some kind of sense. Okay, but so the little g gods, yeah.
Yes,
In other words, we are dealing with flesh and blood beings
yes,
that had freakishly long life expectancies.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And again, um, when they died, their spirits didn't die and they become the Shay people, right?
Mm.
But not to be confused with the elemental Shay groups that are kind of intertwined there. They are smaller creatures, lower in the visible hierarchy, with counterfeit spirits as well. And when they die, their spirits don't go to sleep as well. So you have different hierarchies with the visible representatives and with the invisible ones. And the invisible ones can be uh, the highest ones, which are the fallen angels or the gods, but they can also take a physical form, right? So just
Mhm.
so that people are aware of that. And then you have all of the different beings that they created with a counterfeit spirit that would fill out also the invisible ones at the lower hierarchy, typically understood as Nephilim and Raphaim and other types of creatures like that, some chimera type creatures, and or the four groups of elementals, which are the
The-
fairy people, the little ones, and the
the-
salamanders, which are a reptilian group.
yeah. The Scythians are a pretty brutal bunch, I
Oh
would
yeah.
say. They had this, you know, scalping of the enemy and then collecting the scalps in order to, yeah, let's say, transfer the power of the enemy to themselves.
Yes.
So, whoa.
It's kind of like drinking blood or the
Mhm.
quickening effect of, sucking out their spirit for their energy. It's the same type of belief. They believe that they could collect the energy of those that they killed or were sacrificed to them as demigods to help them live longer and to be more like gods. So the Scythians are the aboriginals as part of the Indo-Aryan groups. Scythia are basically into the northern part of Asia Minor, northern parts of Greece, into the Ukraine, and they're the ones who migrate further distances than the other groups like the dark-haired Aryans. So you get that overflowing into the Mongolian Empire, into Russia, all the way over into England. So yeah, the Scythians were, and you can look at some common patterns as they show up after the flood. These are the ones who were expert horseback riders.
Mhm.
They were the ones who created the chariots. They're the ones who created iron. They're the ones who became the super warriors and the super armies that got control of all of the human populations and established themselves as the ring lords and the overlords and the kings and the royales because they are the noble ones as Aryan is defined. And so they controlled the early post-Diluvian world through their weapons, and nobody could stand against them.
So what I find a little bit irritating is usually when we look at fairies, yeah, then they are presented as these little tiny creatures
Yeah,
with, very delicate wings, and they fulfill wishes. And then you have fairy trees, and some farmers,
yep,
they farm around that, and
yep,
the tree is not to be touched. And it is being sold to children as a very sweet race of elementals or
yeah.
what have you. So, but actually, they are, yeah. Nephilim that came after the flood, right?
In part, yeah, in part, and probably before the flood too. So different groups as we talked about. So let's look at the Lord of the Rings.
Hmm.
So you're getting that fairy concept from a Norse ideology of the Tuatha De Danann and the fairy folks. So you're going to get some of the small ones in there. You're going to see hobbits. You're going to see dwarves. Um, and others. And so you're also going to see the Elven people.
Yeah.
And the Tuatha De Danann is the royal Magianic bloodline of the Elven race. And Elven is another term for fairy. And so it's the LB gens that they sort of as their bloodline allegory for the genealogy. And so when we look at the white elves, that are portrayed in The Lord of the Rings are taller. They're not portrayed fully as giants. But if you look at that imagery of the tall white elf, they're a very noble type of people, and they're blonde hair, blue-eyed, hazel eyes, and that they are part of that larger group, but they're not part of the little ones. And so these are ones that you could pull up and Google a picture of a painting of the Riders of the Sidhe, Sidhe, and you're going to see that imagery. And they're going to have a lot of polytheist imagery in there with serpents and a whole bunch of other things that are going on. And they're very pale skinned, right? So the description is pretty much the same. So that's the representation. And this is an antediluvian story because it ends with a water allegory of all these other creatures sailing away on a boat, which is the allegory of the flood, because now the time is for man. And yet they also show up again after the flood. So it's being consistent to what we set down as the premise for that earlier in that accounting. And the elementals are also three groups of little peoples, and then one that's called salamanders that is taller than a human and are more associated as reptilians that live in the earth in tunnels, part of the alien mythos. The three groups of elementals are good-looking ones and nice ones, just like you have in Peter Pan, right?
Hmm.
And you also have a grouping of mischievous ones that are like the leprechauns, the pixies, the Manohe, and there's many different subgroups in each of these. Well, nymphs would be part of the good-looking ones out of Greek history as well. And then you have the ugly ones like trolls and hobbits and gnomes. And they all have a specific function serving the demigods in the visible hierarchy. So in the Lord of the Rings, you see not the hobbits, the dwarves. The dwarves in fairy mythology lived in the ground. They're shown living in mountains in Lord of the Rings, and they were recorded in mythology as making the weapons for the demigods, which they're doing
Hmm.
in these large factories in the Lord of the Rings. So yes, you have all of these different groups of fairies as part of the fair folk, just as the Tuatha De Danann were also called the fair folk, because they generally have this distinction of this very pale skin. Fair as in fairy. So fair becomes a word in English that's used as a description for beautiful, for the noble ones, right? And the fair hair, the fair skin, strawberry colored hair, versus the darker red is the preferred color in that. And so it becomes that nobility sort of aspect as well. And so most of these little people are not working for humankind's better health and life. They are usually doing horrible things to us as they're actually accounted for as they come through history. So just understand the different sort of understanding of the Elven and the bloodlines of the Elven and the fairies. But when people start to hear what I'm talking about, this very pale skin, they also had when they had this blonde hair. It was not quite the blonde hair that we would have it. It would be not quite as exaggerated as in the House of Dragon.
Hmm.
And of
It
course,
was
they
more
have
white. Mm,
Yeah, it's more of
mhm,
a bleached white that they're showing, and it may have been closer to the albino, but not fully albino by the look, but certainly distinct than just pale skin that we would normally associate that with today. And the hair would have been more closely associated with a whiter color with maybe with a hint of gold versus the bleached white hair that they have. And even with the black people in there, they make their skin albino like, right?
mm,
Um, so there's something also in the albino aspect, but I think it's more of an allegory to get you sort of closer to what that skin color might have looked like.
mhm. And apart from having specific functions for the demigods, was, belonging to the ugly ones some type of punishment?
No, they're just I don't know why they created such different ones, and
Mm.
I guess ugly ones are kind of more my term, but I have seen that referred to, and they're not all that pleasant looking. So, but maybe I have a human bias as to what's good looking and what's not. Who knows? Um, but they were certainly like the gnomes, they are the ones who were in charge of all the technology, all of the genealogies and the knowledge, and there were caretakers for that. And what's interesting about these gnomes is that they, in fairy culture, they have what we would call a UAP or a UFO that comes through a fairy domain, typically, which is means fairy portal, just like we have UFOs just sort of magically appearing and then disappearing, and that you have them kidnapping people and they do sexual experiments on them so that they can regenerate their DNA and continue to reproduce. And if you didn't know it was a fairy abduction, as these accounts come down through our history, you'd swear it was a gray alien abduction. Well, these gnomes are called the Greys, and they are described identically to the gray aliens as part of the alien mythos. So they have different roles and they're different. I will use different forms of ugly as you go through the whole list of the elementals.
So I
Eh,
I know that reports that people believed in and that was passed down over the generations, through the generations, and that, for instance, some fairies would steal babies,
Yeah.
yeah, human babies. So, do you think it was not only this particular group of fairies and they didn't steal only babies, but also grown-ups?
Yes, they did it all
Mhm.
and for different purposes. Certainly, the more innocent someone is, and a baby is as innocent as you can get for a ritual sacrifice, or if you're trying to um, take the spirit that's in the blood and enter it into you as the fairy quickening um, allegories go, then you would want very young and very pure. But they did both. And child sacrifice is very much part of the whale worship of the Tuatha De Danann and the Indo-Aryans and of the polytheist occult religions, and was significant in the Baal culture, right?
Mm.
Um, so it's a commonality that was there. But we also have to remember within the culture of the spurious offspring is a duality that's good and evil. So you have good magic and black magic. You have good giants and evil giants, good kings and evil queens, evil kings. You have good witches and evil witches. It's just a constant. And that's just showing two different agendas within their belief system. All want to get to the same destiny. One would just wipe humankind from the face of the earth instantaneously. The other ones want to utilize us to get to that agenda. but at the same goal, they still have the same means. It's just a different methodology. So you have these rivalries that show up. Not only that, there can only be one dynasty that can rule in their future time, but also different ways of getting there and how they would like to see this knowledge that comes from the gods applied.
Yeah, and it is being sold to children as something cute and
Yeah.
adorable.
Yes. It's amazing, isn't it? Then and
It's
they
sneaky.
it's very sneaky, and they get them prepared right from the young to accept things more easily than people ought to accept things. And I grew up watching Walt Disney. I mean, you can't get a more occult type of entertainment that's promoted with the fairy tale concept with all of these different types of creatures, including giants, and good and evil and the same type. It's everything about it is occult. And people say he was Freemason, and he probably was, but he rose higher than Freemason because he was in the entertainment end. So he would have been as high as Rosicrucian.
Yeah. Yeah, now, with this type of information, then all of a sudden you look at those cartoons that
Yeah,
are allegedly child friendly. You look at them with very different eyes.
yeah, you
Yeah,
do.
yeah. I
And
remember.
they're masters at putting their belief system and their history into entertaining narratives for children and for adults and everything in between. So they're absolute experts at it.
Mhm. So if both groups have the goal, the demise of humanity, why not, you know, do it and be done with it?
Yeah.
I don't
If
get
they
it.
could, if they could, they would. And
Hmm.
they've tried many times. And so there's a level of technology that has to be in place for them to succeed. And they've gotten very close several times in the past, but they want to absolutely not only ensure humanity is wiped from the face of the earth, that the earth is wiped, is destroyed by fire. And that when Mitra, as we would understand Mitra coming out of Zoroastrianism and Sanskrit, will come back at the end of the age as an incarnation for the Antichrist, Lord Mitra,
Mhm.
Baphomet, Father Mitra, as the Templars worshipped, um, probably Azazel or an Azazel type